All right, now give us more perspective in terms of what is unfolding at this moment. We are joined by retired Captain Alok Bansal, who is the Director of India Foundation and the Executive Director of the South Asian Institute for Strategic Affairs. He's joining us live on this broadcast. Now, Captain Bansal, considering what we have witnessed this evening, although at this moment we need to reiterate and point out to our viewers that everything is under control and that the Indian Foreign Affairs Ministry, the Foreign Secretary who came a little while earlier, he said that India is looking at this as a clear violation of the agreement that was struck between the two DGMOs. In your assessment, what seems to be happening here?
See, firstly, the way the ceasefire was brought about, it was all of a sudden. So I guess we were all taken in by surprise. It was a pleasant surprise. But even then, one was suspicious whether it would hold on, because Pakistan's army, led by General Asim Munir, needs to harbor ideological hatred for India, which they perceive as a Hindu India. And as a result, there was a sense of disquiet whether this ceasefire would hold. And by daybreak, there were already reports that there is ceasefire violations along the line of control where there were firings, which were initially thought that is some rogue elements within Pakistani army who are firing, or a result of clear instructions not being passed to the lower commanders. But then there were blasts in Srinagar, then there were drones attacks in Jammu, there was infiltration in Nagrota, and then there was no doubt that there were the attacks were taking place.
Right.
Now, one doesn't really know whether it is intentional or it is as per the directives of General Asim Munir and his cohorts, or it is a result of people who are not willing to accept a ceasefire in Pakistan. Because in Pakistani army, there are people who are even more radical than Asim Munir, and they may probably not be willing to accept a ceasefire when it has been negotiated by him. Although Pakistan has limitations as far as its war-waging potential is concerned, to the best of my knowledge, they really don't have artillery shells left more than 1 or 2 days. And other economic situation is also pretty bad. On the border districts, they have actually stopped all petrol pumps. So with that sort of a scenario, army was not in a position to fight, but then there are rogue elements which could still be believing. But when the drones came, I think that benefit of doubt which one could have given, that there are rogue elements, etc., probably one had to take it away, because drones came much later after the ceasefire had come into being, and they came into cities like Jammu, etc. And they were obviously being controlled by people from across the border. And whoever was controlling him at least was at a fairly senior level, was at least functioning under a fairly senior commander, because to the best of my knowledge, the drones are not dispersed at lower units. They are still controlled by a certain higher level of formation. So obviously there is something amiss as far as Pakistan is concerned. It seems that not everybody is on board as far as the ceasefire is concerned. Or even worse, ceasefire could just be a tactical ploy by Pakistan army to win some time and to persuade US to ensure that their IMF tranche gets approved because US has a huge role to play as far as IMF board is concerned. And US had blocked it, that would have been catastrophic for Pakistan.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, the Pakistanis would like to keep the United States happy with the fact that this ceasefire agreement was announced to the world by that tweet by Donald Trump, where he said that India and Pakistan have agreed after they held their talks for a ceasefire, and that the ceasefire will come into effect at 5 p.m. local time here in India. Now, if Pakistan is violating an agreement that has been effectively mediated for them by the Americans, this would be seen as an embarrassment for Donald Trump. How do you think the Americans are looking at these developments, and would they be happy with what the Pakistanis are doing?
See, as far as American-sponsored ceasefire agreements or negotiations are concerned, they have been violated with impunity across the globe. They were negotiating between Russia and Ukraine. It didn't work out. Sometimes they were criticizing Zelensky. Sometimes they were criticizing Putin. Even between Netanyahu and Hamas, they have been negotiating. They have really not worked out. The negotiations with Iran are still progressing. Donald Trump announced that Houthis have agreed. After that, again, there have been attacks on ships. So one really doesn't know under the present US dispensation whether what would be their reaction, because this government of US is more transactional. If tomorrow Pakistan says that they are willing to import some US goods or something of certain value or substantial, probably they would condone Pakistan's misgivings or Pakistan's misdemeanor. So one really doesn't know. Ideally, they should have actually taken Pakistan to task, because IMF is virtually controlled by them. They have a huge share in IMF, and they could have easily blocked Pakistan's second tranche of the $7 billion IMF loan, which they have not done. So the leverage which they have, probably they have let go, and I'm not sure what they could do. But still, they have a big leverage, because most of the Pakistani elite has their children or relatives in US, and most senior army officers and other elite in Pakistan, including politicians, value their US visas very significantly. So US has that capability to arm twist them. Let's wait and watch what the US does, because this ceasefire violation has clearly undermined Trump's negotiating skills, which I'm not really very appreciative.
Right. I'm pretty sure there will be an American reaction to what has been done here, drones flying in the Indian airspace. But I also want you to weigh in on the agreement itself that was struck. This is an agreement where it was agreed that there will be a ceasefire without any preconditions. You know, the fact that India had such a clear advantage in the last 4 days of fighting, do you think India should it not have made it conditional that Pakistan should give up, some of these operatives, especially the TRF individuals, which is, of course, a breakaway group that is sponsored by the Lashkar-e-Taiba? Should India not have made it conditional for Pakistan that the leadership of the Lashkar-e-Taiba should have been handed over for a ceasefire?
See, I'm not much of a warmonger, and I, like most Indians, would prefer peace to return. Having said that, I think the ceasefire came at a time when conflict.
No, but if we hold the advantage on the battlefield, Captain Bansal, this is not warmongering. This is what the Americans would, of course, do themselves. They would demand individuals who've perpetrated certain crimes, individuals who've been responsible for carrying out acts of terror. Should India not make it conditional that when India has the advantage on the battlefield, and if a ceasefire agreement is something that Pakistan wants, because this call for a ceasefire was initiated by the Pakistanis. It is the Pakistani DGMO who called his Indian counterpart and asked for a ceasefire. Should India not have pressed its advantage, demanded that Pakistan should give up the top leadership of the TRF and the Lashkar-e-Taiba, and then Pakistanis could have had their ceasefire?
You did not let me complete my statement, so
go
let
ahead,
me clarify.
Go ahead, Captain Bansal.
I was just trying to say that while I appreciate peace and seek peace, the ceasefire came at a very, very wrong time to my mind, because that was the time when Pakistani arms and ammunitions were, especially the ammunition supply, was withering away. Pakistan's economic wherewithal was coming to an end. There was already a crisis of petroleum products. All the petrol pumps on the border areas were closed down to conserve fuel, and there were problems. So India, by agreeing at that point of time to a ceasefire, was giving Pakistan actually a helping hand. And we could have probably asked Pakistan to release at least some of the Indian who have been taken into custody illegally by Pakistan, like Kulbhushan Yadav, and asked for those people who have been designated as global terrorists, like Hafiz Saeed or Jaish-e-Mohammed leader Masood Azhar, who was actually in Indian prison till he was released in lieu of Kandahar hijacking.
Absolutely.
So India would have been justified in asking for this sort of elements, and of course TRF, if we could have given them the names or something like that. But notwithstanding anything, I think peace is always welcome for a country like India, which is actually at this time growing exponentially economically, and one would not like to do something that derails India's economic growth. But knowing Pakistan's DNA, that will they stick to this ceasefire was always a question mark. But no one anticipated that within 3 hours of signing the ceasefire or ceasefire coming into effect, there'll be violations that we'll be seeing across the entire international border and line of control.
You know, is there a lesson that India, of course, needs to look upon and ponder over, that every time there are negotiations in the aftermath of a conflict, India has been more than generous in letting Pakistan off the hook? You know, from the reports that have come in from the battlefield in terms of what had happened in the last 4 days, the Pakistanis were on the ropes. But here, the fact that there was an unconditional ceasefire, we seem to have let the Pakistanis off the hook, because this war for the Pakistanis was simply unsustainable. So on the one hand, we say that terror is simply not acceptable to us, but on the other, once we've got the military advantage, why is it that we're not pressing it home so that the Pakistanis get the message that, listen, you know, there cannot be just an unconditional ceasefire. There is a cost that has to be paid for that ceasefire.
I have no doubts that though the ceasefire gave us higher moral ground, I think politically, militarily, it was, I think, not the opportune moment to seek the ceasefire. But one doesn't know what the US offered in lieu of the ceasefire. There's possibility that US may have given some incentive to both India and Pakistan for agreeing for a ceasefire, because President Trump wanted to project to the world that he is in a position to bring about this ceasefire.
Right.
So maybe they gave some tariff concessions or some trade deal, which was extremely lucrative, and the policymakers probably felt that it was worth taking their chance. So obviously the leaders who accepted the ceasefire would know better, because one is not aware of fully what was negotiated behind those doors and what were offered by the US or what Pakistan agreed to during those negotiations. But with the benefit of hindsight, one could say that, yes, I told you so. Pakistan will never stick to its promises. And that's where we find ourselves at this point of time. There is a sense of deja vu at this point of time that, yes, Pakistan has not really stuck to what it had agreed to do.
Absolutely, indeed. And Pakistan, of course, has this strategy of war with 1,000 cuts, to bleed India with 1,000 cuts, which is what these acts of terrorism actually are. You know, do you, Captain Bansal, think that India's strategy in dealing with acts of terror has been more reactive? Because there would be a terror attack that happens and then India, of course, goes in and responds. Is there a different approach that is now needed? That even in instances where there is no terror attack that has happened, but these specific individuals who in the past have been perpetrating attacks, because Hafiz Saeed is an individual that we've been talking for more than 2 decades. Masood Azhar is someone that we've been talking for more than 2 decades. Why is it that even though we've got time on our side, that we've not been able to take them out?
Well, they have been sheltered and shielded by the security establishment in Pakistan, which sees them as an extension of their security apparatus. And consequently, they have survived. Masood Azhar, as you know, had been apprehended, was in Indian jail, and he was released from there in lieu of Kandahar hijacking. Well, we need to work out a strategy for dealing with such cross-border terrorism, and I think we have made it very clear that acts of terror will be dealt with strongly. And in this particular event, after the Pahalgam attack, we have shown to Pakistan that we have the capability of carrying out strikes deep inside Pakistan, wherein we actually targeted even Bahawalpur camp, which was more than 100 kilometers away from the international border. And this, despite our aircraft not even crossing the international border. So we have shown that we have the capability, we could do that. But I agree that while negotiating a ceasefire, one doesn't know what were the compulsions of government of India or what were the incentives offered by the United States
Right.
for accepting the ceasefire.
Captain Bansal, for people who've been watching these incidents of terror that have happened for the last 2, 3, 4 decades, since the 80s and 90s, that the Pakistanis have been, backing these non-state actors to come and wreak havoc in India. It's a lesson that they learned when the Mujahideen were able to oust the Soviets in Afghanistan. And that's the same playbook that they've tried to use in the Kashmir Valley as well. Is there something that India should now do differently so that the Pakistani deep state and the Pakistani military learns a lesson that what the Mujahideen could do with the Soviets in Afghanistan is simply not going to happen in the Kashmir Valley?
See, there is no doubt that there was a time when ISI thought that what they have successfully done against Soviet Union could be replicated against India. In fact, one of the ISI brigadiers wrote a book, Bear Trap, where he talked about this strategy. And the same strategy was tried against India. But they realized that such a strategy doesn't work against India, and we have successfully foiled this strategy. What I think India needs to do is to take steps to undermine Pakistan's military. We need to understand that an average Pakistani may not hold any ill will.
Right.
And in fact, people in minority provinces like Balochistan, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa or Sindh are not really against India. But it is the Pakistan's military and security establishment which has been consistently acting against India. So India should try and do anything that undermines the power or the strength of Pakistan's military. And that is where I felt that ceasefire at this point of time, when Pakistan's military capability could have withered away with the passage of time, probably was not a right step at that point of time against an adversary who has never been reliable and has always violated the agreements which have been reached mutually.
Indeed, Captain Bansal. Thank you very much indeed, sir, for joining us and getting us all that perspective. This is what the situation looks like at this moment. Things are calm. The Indian Armed Forces have ensured that there is nothing untoward that is happening. The ceasefire, the very tenuous ceasefire, it continues to hold, but the agreement that the two DGMOs, the Pakistani DGMO, when he called up the Indian DGMO and agreed to, was violated by the Pakistani side. This is what the Indian Foreign Ministry has said. And if there is a repetition of this kind of a violation from the Pakistani side again, then the Foreign Secretary there, Vikas Mistry, he had of course pointed out that the Indian government has given the instructions to the Indian Armed Forces to respond in a manner that is suitable. This is what the skies look like over Barmer before. These are not live visuals. These are visuals from before, from a couple of hours earlier. But things are under control. Things are normal. There is quiet. There is peace for the time being. There is a tenuous ceasefire agreement that continues to hold. And the Pakistani military establishment, are there rogue elements that are present in it who are probably trying to do some mischief? That is not very clear. Remember, after 4 days of intense fighting, this is scenes that were simply unprecedented, something that had not been witnessed. There was a ceasefire agreement that was mediated to by the Americans for the Pakistani side that did come into effect. And now this is how things stand. The tenuous ceasefire continues to hold. Things are under control. No one needs to panic. The civil administration has instructed the people of the precautions that they need to take, and the Indian Armed Forces are, of course, on alert. We'll slip into a short break now. Don't go anywhere. On the other side, we'll continue tracking all the developments that are happening. Stay tuned to WION.